Poor Bonnie D. I never believed she had one whip of human curiosity. I never, in all the time she was married to Uncle Daniel, heard her say, "What next?" Eudora Welty, The Ponderheart. I'm Jacob Shemansky. You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review on AMI Audio. Today, regular contributor Danielle McGlocklan and I want to highlight an author whose writing has so much character, an extremely distinctive personal voice that just oozes Southern charm. Danielle McGlocklan, welcome back to the show. Who is Eudora Welty?
Well, lovely to be back here. Thank you so much, Jacob. Eudora Welty was an American writer. She is best known for her short stories, though she wrote numbers of novels. She died in 2001. Is that correct? Yes.
In
Um,
2001.
um, she was acknowledged by the literary world as being one of the best observers of human behavior, and also a person who wrote with great humor, tenderness, and her writing was very evocative of the southern United States in its time. She was very well known, and one of the stories that I asked you to read, called "Why I Live at the PO," was extremely popular, and when I was in school, it was read by every high school student. Everybody had to read Eudora Welty because her writing was exemplar. This is how you write a short story. And, anybody who is interested in short stories, and I continue to be interested in short stories many decades later, can hold her up as somebody who knew exactly how this is done. Um, and consequently, she is one of my favorite writers.
Yeah, that story, Why I Live at the PO, is one of the best short stories I've ever read. Not necessarily because of the plot, but because of the feeling, the setting, the place it puts you in. And again, it's Eudora Welty's voice that brings this thing to life because it happens in a town called China, something weirdly enough, in like a small town in Mississippi.
Yep.
And it follows the narrator is somebody called Sister. You actually never hear her name. And basically, her grievances with her family that lead her to go and live at the post office. Hence the title, Why I Live at the Post Office. And the family squabbles are delightfully petty and delusional. And it makes you wonder, as the reader, is Sister just self-righteous and like just justifying herself to the reader? Or is she like the victim of a problematic family? And this is all in this beautiful southern setting. And all of these little squabbles are incredibly fun and stupid and petty and but still very, very human.
And also a little bit mysterious, because you have one of the characters is a child called Shirley T, clearly named after Shirley Temple, who at that time was extremely popular as a child actor, and this child has curly hair. But where she comes from seems rather mysterious, and
Hmm.
Sister is not buying that she is an adopted child. Sister seems to think that she actually is the biological child of her sister, who brings her home back to the family, having left her husband, also under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Um, and the playing of favorites, who's the favorite of Papa Daddy?
Yeah,
Who
Papa
is the
Daddy.
Papa Daddy? I have to say that my family loved Papa Daddy so much that they would refer to my husband occasionally as
As
Papa
Papa
Daddy,
Daddy?
because they just thought it was so funny. But um, they the characters are they're over the top, right? They're just they say exactly what they think all of the time. They aren't overly kind to one another, as you
No.
probably notice, um, and yet they are so characteristic of a setting. And as you mentioned, the setting is so important. This tiny little town in the South where everybody knows everybody else. The narrator is the postmistress, which is a sort of part-time job. It doesn't sound like it's much of a job in a town so small that, there probably are no more than a handful of letters every day that are delivered. Um, you know, and so she has the time to, dig in the dirt and to literally dig in the dirt. So she's getting into everybody's business, but she's also, planting a bit of a garden and around the post office, and, um, she is an incredible character, as are every other member of her bizarre family. I just found it so enjoyable, and I read it as a teenager and thought, are there really people like that? And now that I'm considerably older, I think, yep, there really are
There
people
are.
like that.
When did you realize that there were families like that?
Good question. As we get older, we meet more and more different sorts of people, I guess. And you sort of stand back in awe.
Mm.
I've been traveling recently, and one of the joys of travel, and I really don't enjoy the travel part of travel, is sitting in an airport and watching people and watching the interaction with families, the parents and children, or sisters and
Mm.
brothers, and you realize it's so complicated. Every family, what was it? I think it was Tolstoy who said, "Every happy family is the same, and every unhappy family has is different in its unhappiness." Um, and you can see that, in spades when you're waiting for that extra 3 hours for your flight. People just get very impatient, and they speak to each other, some very kindly and some not very kindly, and some just walk away.
It takes somebody who's very observant to be able to pick up on the intricacies of dynamics between family members. It takes
Yes.
a great writer to be able to articulate those interesting dynamics, and I think Eudora Welty is both of those things. Um, because you mentioned earlier that she's very observant and has a way of describing dynamics and people and relationships and just human behavior in a very distinctive way,
Yeah.
in ways that you've never seen before. And to give you an example of this, the family lies to each other constantly, or they're kind of
Yes.
deceitful,
Right.
and they kind of troll each other. Like they play, it's not really pranks, but they're just kind of like being mean spirited in a way.
Yeah.
But sometimes one person will lie to the other, and they'll just accept the lie.
Mhm.
They'll accept the lie because it kind of serves their ends to, like, understand that the person's lying and just be like, "Oh, it proves to me that this person's a liar." And it's like, it's not even worth tackling the lie anymore.
No, it's almost comforting in a certain
Yes. Yeah,
fashion,
exactly. It's
right?
like you're
Oh,
comfortable in
yeah.
your dysfunctionality.
Yeah. Yeah. I would when we're talking about how observant Eudora Welty is, I'd like to read you a paragraph, if I
Please.
might, which is from the preface to her collected short stories. She wrote this. Um, this this is something that happened numbers of years ago. She wrote this in 1980. Where is the voice coming from is unique, however, in the way it came about. That's the name of a short story. That hot August night when Medgar Evers, the local civil rights leader, was shot down from behind in Jackson, I thought with overwhelming directness, whoever the murderer is, I know him. Not his identity, but his coming about in this time and place. That is, ought to have learned by now, from here, what such a man intent on such a deed had going on in his mind. I wrote his story, my fiction, in the first person, about the character's point of view, I felt, through my shock and revolt, I could make no mistake. The story pushed its way up through a long novel I was in the middle of writing and was finished on the same night the shooting had taken place. It's only 2 pages long.
Wow.
At the New Yorker, where it was sent and where it was taken for the immediately forthcoming issue, William Maxwell, who is the editor, who had already known on sight all I could have told him about this story and its reason for being, edited it over the phone with me. By then, an arrest had been made in Jackson, and the fiction's outward details had to be changed where by chance they had resembled too closely those of
Huh.
actuality. For the story must not be found prejudicial to the case of a person who might be on trial for his life. I
Wait,
have been
so
told. So what she did was she wrote a fictional story that was so close to what had actually happened that she was required to make changes to further fictionalize it, because the concern was what she had written would actually prejudice the trial of the accused person. So this woman is such an observer and such an understander of her own society. She was able to create immediately after this very famous murder of the civil rights worker, Medgar Evers. She was able to create a story that so closely paralleled what had actually happened, even though she had no special knowledge. She actually had to change it in order not to prejudice the courts. I
sh
think that says everything to me about what an observer Eudora Welty was.
she was such a good observer that she was able to connect the dots where she
Yeah,
didn't know where the dots were, right? It's,
that's
because she had some information about the case, the murder, but she was able to, just based on her intuition of people and the little information that she had, to fill in the blanks of what she didn't know. It just so happened that the way she filled in the blanks was so parallel to the real case once they had done investigations and everything, that they had to like redact information.
well,
That's
I mean, it was
unbelievable.
it's remarkable. It's remarkable, and her editor in the New Yorker knew it. I mean, it was within days of the murder that this story was submitted, and this happened. I mean, she had as much information as anybody who watches news on television or reads the newspaper would have, and yet, as we say in Why I Live at the PO, her knife-like insight into how people actually are creates a whole world, creates an entire way of understanding the society, and that's why I love her so much. But
It
Jacob, I
takes
wanted to ask you,
Mhm.
because these stories were written in their own time and in the southern United States, in Mississippi, um, did you find any of the language problematic, or did you find any of the, I don't want to say stereotyping, because she really doesn't stereotype people. She gives them very distinct characteristics, but they're distinct characteristics that have a racialized quality, in certain stories. How did that strike you?
I didn't find it particularly problematic or anything like that. Like, listen, I've read older stories that had
Mhm.
shocking passages that you can tell just did not age well. Not
Uh-huh.
the case with her writing here. You do notice that, like, the writing style itself is different,
Yeah.
because that's something that you notice nowadays, that the writing that authors tend to use is more homogenous in a way. Like, there's kind of a more generic way of writing, where classics tend to be, um more representative of the writer's voice. And there's just certain things like sentence structure that's more free. Sometimes you'll see like 10 commas in a sentence, or they'll say and 20 times, not 20 times,
Mhm.
but like a lot.
Yeah,
But I think you're
repeatedly.
wondering more about like the cultural representation. I mean, this is just kind of an aspect of Southern stories more generally, right? The
Yeah.
aftermath of the Civil War in America,
Mhm.
and the legacy of plantations and slavery.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
as somebody who's from Canada, like, I'm very far removed from all the implications of that. And I do feel like some of that is lost on me a little bit. Like these
Mm.
little subtle clues, these implications, maybe these things that I ought to know, but I don't, because I just don't live in that area. So I did feel like some of it flew over my head. Like the way some of the black characters interact with the white characters
Yeah.
is a little strange. And
It is,
I have
and
no
it
idea how that
really
works.
interestingly, I mean, you're right. This is the legacy of slavery. The character in the Ponder Heart, Narcisse, who is, she has a lot of agency. She really knows what's going on, probably more than most of the others do. But there's this whole sense that, one of the roles of a wife, and Uncle Daniel, the one of the prime characters in the Ponder Heart, goes through a few wives. He, he you know, the one of the roles of the wife is to tell the African American characters what to do. They have their job, the wife's job
Right.
is to direct people. Narcisse is, as I said, has plenty of agency and is able to figure out, you know, her role, but it's careful, and do we don't know whether Narcisse herself had been a slave or whether she comes from, it's in a plantation area. So, clearly her family had come from that. There's a place where African American people live and a place where white people live, and they aren't, they don't intersect except, in a workplace, or in a place where one group serves another group. And I don't know if you could write a story with those characteristics now. I mean, if you're
Hmm.
writing historical fiction, you kind of have to.
Yeah.
But I think she does it, um, with great gentleness. I don't think she's stereotyping anybody. I think that's one of the things we can say about Eudora Welty. There are no stereotypes. Everybody is a unique and frequently a bizarre character. Um, but you know, but I wondered if you would find that this sort of struck you as being difficult. She uses the word Negro, which at the time these stories were being written was the polite word to use. They didn't use African American; that hadn't been developed yet.
No.
Um, there were other words were considered sort of polite. Like the word colored was, when I was growing up, that was the polite word to use. That you don't use that one any longer. So the language changes over time, but of course, stories that are written all those years ago, those don't change over time. So, in your view, do you believe that Eudora Welty should be taught in schools today?
Absolutely. One of the beautiful things of historical fiction is that it tells a story that just happens to be in a historical setting. And you need to teach history, and teaching history in the matter of fact way, like this happened on this date and this battle happened on that date because of so and so reasons, is very dry, boring, and misses the context. Historical fiction does an amazing job at setting up the context, the feeling of the time, the way people were at the time, the way people interacted at the time. In history class, you don't talk about the way white people and black people were interacting in the South in 1940s Mississippi, Like you
That's
don't get
right.
into that type of detail. You only get that in stories. Now, the funny thing is, these short stories, but these stories from Eudora Welty, they're not historical fiction. They're just
No,
fiction.
they're fiction.
They just
They're
happen to be written at the time, right? And so
That's
they're
right.
uniquely accurate, I would argue, more so than historical fiction than they were if they were written today.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you were to get rid of any book that had words that are seen as unpolitically correct nowadays,
Mhm. Yeah,
well, what do
you'd
you
get rid
gain?
of
What do you gain
y
by getting rid of them?
you gain
Right?
nothing. You lose a huge amount. I mean, even reading Jane Austen, which is fiction, it's not
Mhm.
historical fiction, but she wrote at in her own contemporary time, right? So it was contemporary fiction when she wrote it, just the way Eudora Welty's work was contemporary fiction when she wrote it. Um, but if you decided that we want to get rid of certain language and therefore the books that contain that language, what a terrible loss to literacy that would be. And I maintain that if you want to teach this kind of work, you know you have to be well informed. You have to have an understanding of what the world was like during the period of time in which it
That's not a
was
bad
written.
thing. You're
I think it's a
forcing people to
wonderful thing.
engage.
Yeah, absolutely. um, I right now, I may have mentioned to you that I'm on the TMU, the Toronto Metropolitan University, has a Center for Freedom of Expression,
Hmm.
and I'm now a a senior fellow there. So, my focus on freedom of expression has, been lifelong. But
Hmm.
right now, we're looking at an issue that's coming out of Alberta, where the Alberta government has proposed guidelines for school libraries, which would succeed in eliminating um, books that involve gender, generally speaking. Um, and it's a real worry. It's a real worry that kids won't be able to get access in their school libraries to books that might be very important for them to actually get hold of. And when I think about Eudora Welty, if we were to say, books that characterize racialized people in, what could be argued as a negative fashion, we can't have that any longer. I, you know, I, you and I discussed James early on. The book
Hmm.
that's been lauded because it gives the character Jim in Huckleberry Finn a whole new opportunity to be the main character in his story. Um, and, some people have said, well, we should be reading that instead of Huckleberry Finn because the character Jim in Huckleberry Finn is a slave, or, is running away from slavery, uh, and doesn't appear to have the same degree of agency that he was given in our contemporary novel, James. Um, I think you would do a great disservice to both books if you did that. And I
Because
think that
the book's James doesn't exist without Huckleberry Finn.
that's right.
And James obviously adds to the context of Huckleberry Finn quite a bit. To just replace Huckleberry Finn, that's like skipping to the second book of a series. You're missing so much important context. Hmm.
Well, yeah,
Hmm.
and as I mentioned, I'm not a big fan of James because, I think that he becomes very simplistic and in his
Hmm.
solutions to problems, whereas Mark Twain was not simplistic in his solutions, and kept things moving along in a way that wasn't just a bit trite. But that's my view, and I understand many people disagree with me, and I'm very happy to hear all about that. But I'm just concerned that writers like Eudora Welty and Eudora Welty herself may disappear because people will feel discomfort in seeing how the South is portrayed. That the characters who, in my view, are incredibly funny. I don't know. Did you find yourself laughing out loud at all?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. There's so
Oh,
much color in these characters. So, just these lively characters that are very flawed and also like very impressive in certain ways.
yes.
But even they have huge biases, but they're reflected and it's accurate. We all have our biases. We all have our
Yeah.
faults, right? And some these are things that change regardless of the time period. You know, people will always have faults, right? But
Yeah.
to get back on this, on your work with TMU with freedom of expression, if you were to ban books that refuse that um that portray, you know, not necessarily uh positive portrayals of certain time periods and places and people, what you're missing is you're kind of, what am I trying to say here? It's kind of dumbing down
Yeah.
the
You're
content. You're
whitewashing
you're
history.
whitewashing it, but more than anything, you're kind of disrespecting people's intelligence.
Absolutely right.
Do you not trust
Absolutely.
people to be able to discern the context of this? That this
Yeah.
could be problematic and still interesting? Let me give you an example. This is a much more egregious example of bad portrayal, but still within context. In The Count of Monte Cristo, this is a book that
Mhm,
came out in the 1840s, I think. The story
mhm,
takes place in the 1820s, if I remember correctly. The Count Edmond Dantes, he has a slave. Like the hero of the story just has a slave. He goes to, and it's like it's not really seen as like a bad thing. Although, like
mhm,
in Europe at the time, it was seen as like somewhat of a novelty to have
mhm.
slaves, especially
Yeah.
in France. And he goes to a dinner party, And as like a party trick, he shows off his slave. And all the other guests are like, wow. So he does everything you tell him to. And he's like, yep, anything. And you don't pay him. Nope. And it's seen as like this whole like party trick. And it's because it was written in like 1840s, it's written completely dry, like completely deadpan. And it's
Mhm.
completely jarring, but fascinating because yeah, it reminds you this was written in 1840 and we've
Yeah.
changed since then.
Somewhat.
Somewhat.
Yeah. Well, I have a somewhat bleak view of history in that, you know, when I was growing up, people had this belief that human rights, liberties, were things that we would accrue more and more and more over time, and that people would become freer and be more and more respected
They
over
don't
time.
lose them.
Yeah.
Mm.
However, I don't know if you've been paying much attention to our neighbors to the south, but you can see that you can lose your rights as quickly as you can gain them. Now, slavery, it currently is illegal in the United States, and certainly in Canada. Uh, However, there are countries where slavery may not be lawful, but is still practiced. And are we going to say that never again? I don't know. I think that we also need
Jeez.
to read this kind of literature because we need to know, you know, what not to do. How can we ensure that our rights are protected? How can we, enjoy the fact that we understand history or that we can understand history without having to repeat it?
Respect people's intelligence. It really comes
Yes.
down to that.
Yeah,
It's
including children, right, Jacob? We
absolutely. If kids are confused, then explain it to them,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
But as a parent, as an educator, it's your job to clear things up, right? And it's these are
yeah,
important lessons for people to learn.
thank you. I agree.
I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time, Danielle. Always appreciate your insights. That's Eudora Welty. She has quite a few books. We were talking about Why I Live at the PO. That's a short story that's available just on YouTube for anybody who's interested. It's really fun. And then also shout out to The Ponder Heart, which we didn't quite get to, but is a really fantastic novella she was well known for. Danielle, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jacob. Take care
Of
now.
course. That was regularly contributor Danielle McGlocklan. And that's all the time we have for today's episode. AMI Audiobook Review airs weekends at 1 p.m. Eastern on AMI Audio and repeats every 6 hours. We're on all the big podcasting platforms, and that includes YouTube. Send us your feedback at audiobookreview at ami.ca. That's audiobookreview at ami.ca. And you can follow us on Instagram at AMI Audiobook Review. That's at AMI Audiobook Review. I'm Jacob Szymanski. Happy listening.